Forget everything you have seen in romantic historical movies. Crossing the ocean a century ago wasn't just about sipping champagne and staring at the stars. It was a heavily policed nightmare. Today we are bringing you 50 bizarre, strict, and entirely real rules passengers had to follow on early ocean liners. Get ready for an era where the cruise lines owned your schedule, your wardrobe, and even your basic hygiene. 1. If you booked a third-class ticket, your luxury vacation started with a mandatory, highly aggressive hygiene ritual. Shipping companies were utterly terrified of bringing European diseases across the Atlantic. Before you could even look at your assigned bunk, you and your luggage were heavily fumigated and scrubbed down with incredibly strong, eye-watering industrial soaps. It was less of a relaxing spa treatment and much more like being run through a nautical car wash. Would you tolerate this intense public scrubbing just to secure a cheap ticket to New York? 2. First-class passengers enjoyed absolute opulence, but it came with a sartorial dictatorship. If a gentleman dared to appear in the dining saloon after 6 in the evening wearing anything other than a formal evening jacket, a crisp white shirt, and a white tie, he was not just politely corrected. He was actively refused service and banished to eat in his cabin like a grounded child. Even if the ship was currently experiencing a massive storm, you were expected to choke on your caviar looking impeccably sharp. Fashion truly had no mercy on the high seas. 3. The wireless telegraph room was a revolutionary piece of technology, but operators had the authority to censor your annoying gossip. Wealthy passengers loved sending frivolous messages to their friends on land, bragging about their meals or the weather. If the wireless operator decided your messages were wasting too much bandwidth during a busy hour, they would outright refuse to transmit your telegram. Imagine having millions of dollars in the bank, only to be told by a stressed-out radio operator that your Ocean View bragging rights were permanently revoked. 4. For decades, women on luxury liners were strictly forbidden from smoking in public areas. While the men could retreat to opulent, wood-paneled smoking rooms to puff on imported cigars and discuss the stock market, women caught lighting a cigarette on the promenade deck faced severe social ruin and a stern reprimand from the captain. If a female passenger desperately needed nicotine, she had to retreat to her private cabin, lock the door, and blow the smoke out the porthole like a rebellious teenager hiding a bad habit from her exceptionally strict parents. 5. Unmarried women traveling alone were treated as walking public relations disasters. Single female passengers were absolutely forbidden from dining alone or lingering on the decks without a proper chaperone. The cruise lines essentially forced these women to sit at the captain's table or assigned them a married couple to act as their temporary parents. The fear was that an unaccompanied woman might spark a scandalous romance and ruin the pristine reputation of the shipping line. Heaven forbid a woman read a book by herself without causing a maritime crisis. 6. You could pack your trunks with diamonds, but if you whistled a cheerful tune on the open deck, you were considered a major threat to the vessel. Maritime superstition dictated that whistling would literally whistle up a storm, angering the wind and bringing terrible weather down upon the ship. Crew members were legally permitted to confiscate your luggage or confine you to your quarters if they caught you aggressively whistling. Imagine paying thousands of dollars for a transatlantic crossing, only to be placed under house arrest because you hummed a show tune. 7. A simple cough or a loud sneeze in the third-class dining hall could immediately trigger a terrifying medical protocol. Because ship doctors were terrified of a cholera or typhus outbreak, anyone showing mild cold symptoms was instantly detained and relocated to a specialized, isolated sickbay deep in the bowels of the ship. They would lock you in there until the ship docked, purely as a precaution. 8. Maintaining a calm, thoroughly aristocratic demeanor was actually enforced as a hard rule. First-class passengers were heavily instructed that running on the promenade deck was strictly forbidden, as it was considered terribly vulgar and panic-inducing. Astoundingly, this ridiculous rule theoretically applied even during minor emergencies. You were expected to briskly walk toward your lifeboat with quiet dignity, because nothing screams high society sophistication quite like calmly striding toward a watery grave while adjusting your imported diamond cufflinks. 9. Steerage passengers were actually banned from bringing their own fresh fruit on board, and the reasoning was aggressively insulting. Shipping lines pushed a widespread, bizarre medical theory that poor people simply could not digest raw apples or plums without contracting severe intestinal diseases. So, guards at the gangway would literally confiscate your apples. The first-class passengers, meanwhile, were actively gorging themselves on exotic fruit platters every morning. Apparently, extreme wealth was the only scientifically proven cure for a sensitive digestive tract. 10. During extreme winter crossings, ice would rapidly build up on the outside of cabin portholes. Strangely, passengers were strictly forbidden from scraping the frozen glass themselves. You had to ring a bell and wait for a designated ice-clearing steward to arrive with a specific brass tool. If you got impatient and smashed the ice with your shoe, you faced a massive fine for potentially damaging company property. Imagine freezing in your tiny cabin because you are legally not allowed to touch the window until an overworked employee finally shows up. 11. First-class dogs lived significantly better than third-class humans, but even the wealthiest elite could not keep their pets in their cabins. Luxury liners featured highly opulent kennels, complete with specialized dog menus and daily exercise schedules. However, owners were given strictly enforced visiting hours. If you wanted to pet your own French bulldog outside of your designated afternoon time slot, the kennel master would literally block your path. 12. Complaining about ruined clothing was completely useless against the ship's strict liability waivers. The massive funnels constantly spewed greasy, black coal soot all over the luxurious open promenade decks. If a wealthy passenger wore a pristine white summer suit outside and it was completely destroyed by falling ash, the shipping line legally refused to cover the cleaning bill. The rules explicitly blamed the passenger for choosing the wrong outfit. The message was clear. You might be a millionaire, but the dirty ocean breeze answers to absolutely no one. 13. Down in third class, the luxury of having someone else do your dishes simply did not exist. At the start of the voyage, steerage passengers were handed a basic tin plate, a mug, and a single set of cheap utensils. The rule was brutal. You were entirely responsible for washing and keeping track of your own dishes for the entire trip. If you accidentally dropped your tin plate overboard or someone stole it, the kitchen staff would not issue a replacement. You just didn't eat. It was the ultimate version of a maritime camping trip. 14. Card sharps were the absolute terror of the high seas, so the shipping lines deployed undercover detectives. Professional gambling was strictly outlawed, not out of morality, but because wealthy passengers were losing massive fortunes before reaching New York. Plainclothes officers would observe the smoking rooms, and if they suspected you of counting cards or running a scam, they had the full legal authority to confiscate all your cash and confine you to the ship's brig. They were essentially floating casinos equipped with their own secret police force. 15. When electric lighting was first introduced in first-class cabins, the shipping lines deeply mistrusted their passengers' intelligence. Every single cabin featured a prominent, highly condescending plaque strictly forbidding passengers from attempting to light the electric bulbs with a match. The crew was terrified that aristocrats, accustomed to oil lamps, would burn the entire vessel down trying to ignite a glass bulb. 16. For the crew members, making direct eye contact with a first-class passenger was practically treated as a criminal offense. Stewards, deckhands, and cleaners were instructed to blend into the wallpaper and become practically invisible. If a wealthy traveler walked down the corridor, the crew had to press themselves against the wall, stare firmly at the floor, and remain completely silent until the VIP passed. A single unprompted greeting to a millionaire could easily get a hardworking steward fired the second the ship dropped anchor in harbor. 17. Renting a wooden deck chair was a mandatory ritual, but you had absolutely zero control over where it went. You had to pay the deck steward a premium fee, and he placed your chair based strictly on your perceived social rank. If you were a highly influential politician, your chair got the prime, wind-shielded, sunny spot. If you were just new money, you were shoved near the noisy ventilators. Attempting to drag your own chair into a better patch of sunlight was a massive violation of rules, resulting in an immediate public scolding. 18. Leaving expensive jewelry in your locked first-class cabin was a massive legal mistake. The shipping lines had a strict, heavily printed rule, stating they held absolutely zero liability for stolen items, unless you handed them directly to the chief purser. Wealthy socialites were forced to stand in massive, frustrating lines every single morning to check their diamond necklaces out of the ship's master safe, and then line up again at midnight to return them. You essentially had to repeatedly rent your own personal property just to wear it to dinner safely. 19. Third-class passengers were subjected to a strict, non-negotiable nighttime curfew. At exactly 10 o'clock every single evening, massive iron gates were swung shut and physically locked, trapping the steerage passengers below deck. The official excuse was that this prevented people from wandering into first-class areas and ruining the aesthetic. But practically, it turned the lower decks into a floating prison. 20. Steerage passengers were strictly banned from doing any personal laundry in their cabins. After sweating in cramped quarters for days, washing a shirt in a basin seems logical, right? Wrong. The shipping lines claimed that damp clothes strung up on ropes made the ship look like a cheap tenement building and ruined the prestige of the vessel. If an inspector found damp socks drying on your bed frame, you were fined heavily. It forces you to wonder, what exactly did the lower deck smell like on day 6 of a transatlantic crossing in July? 21. You could be heavily penalized for loudly complaining about the ship's bugler. Before intercom systems existed, first-class passengers were violently awakened every single morning by a uniformed crew member marching down the halls blowing a literal brass bugle. This jarring, military-style alarm clock was considered a sophisticated nautical tradition. If you stumbled out of your cabin in a silk robe and demanded the musicians stop ruining your sleep, the purser would politely inform you that your complaints were completely irrelevant against maritime heritage. 22. Ocean travel was so incredibly dangerous that governments had to legally financially incentivize captains to keep you breathing. Under strict maritime passenger acts, a shipping company was legally fined exactly $10 for every steerage passenger who died during the transatlantic crossing. Your life was literally valued at the cost of a few cheap dinners. This rule existed purely to stop captains from starving their lower-class passengers. Does it make you feel perfectly safe knowing your survival was only guaranteed because the captain hated paying fines? 23. Tipping was not a reward for good service. It was a mandatory protection racket. If you did not immediately slip a heavy bribe to your dining steward and cabin boy on the very first day of the voyage, your trip was guaranteed to be miserable. Food would arrive ice cold, bath requests would be mysteriously forgotten, and your luggage might get misplaced. You were essentially paying a massive ransom just to secure basic human rights. How much cash would you realistically hand over to guarantee your soup didn't taste like salty ocean water? 24. Seasickness was handled with aggressive snobbery. In first class, vomiting in any public corridor or promenade was an extreme violation of social decorum. If a wealthy passenger felt ill, they were legally required to discreetly signal a steward, who would produce an elegant silver-plated basin. If you failed to make it to the silver bowl and ruined the imported carpets, you were banished to your cabin until your stomach settled. The ocean does not care about your bank account, but the cruise line absolutely cared about their expensive upholstery. 25. For single men in first class, the seating arrangements arranged by the chief purser were a matter of extreme anxiety. The unwritten rule was that attractive, wealthy young men were forcefully seated next to the unmarried daughters of prominent VIPs to facilitate high society matchmaking. If you complained about being treated like a piece of high-end meat at the dinner table, you risked being relocated to a terrible table next to the swinging kitchen doors. The purser wasn't just managing the dining room, he was running a floating dating agency. 26. In the cramped lower decks, third-class passengers were strictly forbidden from using the ship's cork life preservers as makeshift furniture. Because the beds were often incredibly hard, many people tried to use the bulky life belts as extra pillows or seat cushions. However, compressing the old, fragile cork severely ruined its buoyancy. If an inspector caught you sleeping on the safety equipment, you faced a massive fine. The crew essentially decided that your immediate neck comfort was significantly less important than a theoretical future drowning scenario. 27. Oddly enough, before the devastating maritime tragedies of the early 20th century, participating in a lifeboat drill was often entirely optional for first-class passengers. In fact, many aristocrats flatly refused to put on the cork lifebelts because they were bulky, uncomfortable, and ruined their expensive tailoring. The crew was instructed not to push the issue, preferring to let millionaires skip safety protocols rather than risk a negative customer review. 28. Third-class passengers were subjected to bizarrely strict, random eye inspections at any given moment. Shipping lines were terrified of minor infections that would get immigrants instantly rejected at Ellis Island. Doctors would abruptly halt your walk on the deck to closely examine your vision with cold medical tools. If your eyes looked even slightly red just from the harsh ocean wind, you were marked with chalk and sent to quarantine. Imagine your entire American dream being abruptly canceled simply because you stared at the ocean breeze for too long. 29. You were not allowed to bring your own musical instruments into the public lounges without passing an informal audition. Wealthy travelers frequently brought violins or guitars, but the ship's captain had the ultimate authority to banish you if your playing was deemed mediocre. It was a strict rule designed to protect the eardrums of the social elite from enthusiastic but untalented amateurs. If you struck a sour chord on the piano, a steward would politely but firmly close the lid and suggest you find a much quieter hobby for the remainder of the voyage. 30. Throwing objects off the ship was strictly regulated, but with one insanely reckless exception. In the early days, if the ship passed close to a massive iceberg during daylight hours, the captain would sometimes purposefully slow down so first-class passengers could gather on the deck and throw empty champagne bottles or lumps of coal at the ice for pure entertainment. It was treated like a giant frozen carnival game. In hindsight, casually mocking the giant blocks of ice that could effortlessly sink your ship feels like a spectacularly terrible idea, doesn't it? 31. Wealthy travelers always brought their personal servants, but those maids and valets were forced into a bizarre maritime purgatory. They were strictly banned from entering the first-class dining room with their employers, but it was considered highly inappropriate for them to eat down in third class. Shipping lines created completely separate, hidden dining areas exclusively for servants. You were essentially trapped in a floating middle-class waiting room, forced to make awkward small talk with other bored valets while your boss ate caviar directly above you. 32. Sharing a cramped, poorly ventilated cabin in second or third class meant signing away your absolute right to snore. If your heavy breathing deeply disturbed a fellow passenger, the ship's rules allowed a steward to enter your cabin and aggressively wake you up. You were legally required to roll over and keep quiet. The shipping lines considered loud sleeping to be a massive disruption of public peace. If you were a chronic snorer, you essentially had to stay awake for the entire 5-day crossing just to avoid being constantly poked by an angry night watchman. 33. Religious observance on transatlantic liners was not merely a polite suggestion. It was enforced with absolute ironclad authority. On Sundays, the ship's master strictly ordered the permanent closure of all public card tables. Any form of gambling, betting on the ship's daily run, or playing dice was totally outlawed in the smoking rooms for 24 hours. Wealthy businessmen addicted to high-stakes poker were forced to either attend a church service or sit quietly in a chair. Even in the middle of the ocean, you simply could not escape the Sabbath police. 34. For third-class women, maintaining personal grooming was heavily restricted. Brushing your hair on the open deck was strictly prohibited by the shipping lines. They were paranoid that the harsh ocean wind would blow stray hairs around the deck, creating a massive hygiene violation and ruining the aesthetic of the ship. If a steward caught you detangling your locks outside, you were heavily fined. Would you be willing to brush your hair in a pitch-black, violently swaying lower cabin just to keep the wealthy promenade deck looking completely spotless? 35. Maritime law demanded absolute transparency regarding infectious diseases. If a ship experienced an outbreak of cholera or smallpox mid-voyage, the captain was legally required to hoist a massive yellow flag upon approaching the harbor. This quarantine flag signaled to the port authorities that the vessel was practically a floating biohazard. No passenger, regardless of how incredibly wealthy they were, was allowed to disembark until health inspectors cleared the entire ship. A single sick traveler could legally trap millionaires on board for several extra days.
36.
Your luggage was forced to wear your exact social class on its sleeve. First-class trunks received elegant, beautifully designed bright red stickers, while steerage bags were slapped with aggressive, highly visible yellow tags. It was a maritime caste system permanently glued to your suitcase, ensuring the baggage handlers knew exactly whose belongings to handle with care and whose to aggressively toss into the cargo hold. A single yellow tag instantly told the entire crew that they did not need to treat your fragile belongings with any level of basic respect.
37. Attending Sunday religious services on board was a highly expected social ritual, but God strictly adhered to the ship's ruthless class system. Third-class passengers were entirely banned from joining the beautiful first-class congregation in the main dining saloon. Instead, they were forced to hold their own modest prayers in a cramped lower deck, heavily competing with the deafening vibrations of the ship's massive engines. Apparently, the luxury lines genuinely believed that the wealthy elite required a much fancier environment to properly secure their salvation. 38.
Having fresh milk for morning coffee meant traveling with live dairy cows kept in specialized stalls below deck. First-class passengers were absolutely forbidden from visiting or attempting to feed this livestock. The crew was utterly terrified that some clueless, overly enthusiastic aristocrat would feed the cow an exotic piece of rich chocolate, completely ruin the animal's digestion, and forcefully deprive the entire elite dining room of their morning butter. Protecting the cow's strictly regulated diet was treated as a matter of urgent national security.
39.
When the very first elevators were installed on luxury liners, they caused immense, utterly ridiculous social panic. Single gentlemen were strictly forbidden from riding in an elevator alone with a female lift operator. The shipping lines wanted to entirely prevent any scandalous rumors of improper conduct from forming during a terrifying 40-second vertical journey between decks. If a man wanted to go up to the promenade, he literally had to wait in the lobby until another respectable chaperone arrived to supervise the highly suspicious elevator ride.
40.
Maritime superstition reached peak absurdity near the steering wheel. Passengers were heavily warned against intensely staring at the ship's compass on the bridge. Many old-school captains genuinely believed that a passenger with a strong, hypnotic personality could actually magnetize the needle with their eyes and throw the ship completely off course. Exactly how fragile must your nautical skills be to legally blame a dangerous navigation error on a passenger's aggressive glare? You were essentially forbidden from looking at a clock out of fear of breaking time.
41.
Hiding a mild illness from the crew was a massive violation of the ship's passenger contract. Travelers were legally required to immediately report any mysterious rashes, severe fevers, or persistent coughs to the ship's medical officer. If the crew discovered you were actively concealing symptoms of a highly contagious disease to avoid the isolation ward, you could face severe legal penalties upon docking. You were practically forced to declare every single sneeze to the authorities.
42.
You could pack all the fancy clothes you wanted, but your reading material was heavily policed. First-class libraries strictly banned any literature deemed remotely scandalous or politically radical by the conservative ship owners. If a steward caught you reading an unauthorized socialist pamphlet or a mildly spicy romance novel on the deck, it was swiftly confiscated. You were forced to read incredibly boring, pre-approved historical biographies.
43.
Misspelling a name on an official document could legally ruin your entire life. Shipping lines were bound by federal law to provide an exact, flawless passenger manifest to immigration inspectors at Ellis Island. If the ship's purser accidentally wrote your name incorrectly or recorded your occupation wrong, the authorities could officially reject you and legally force the cruise line to ship you right back to Europe. Your entire American dream could be completely destroyed simply because an overworked ship employee forgot how to correctly spell your last name. 44. The class divide extended heavily to the actual ship's crew, enforced by strict employment laws. Officers and ordinary deckhands were strictly forbidden from conversing with female passengers under any circumstances, unless it was a massive, life-threatening emergency. If a handsome officer was caught casually flirting with a wealthy heiress on the promenade deck, he wasn't just scolded, he would be permanently fired the second the ship hit the docks. The shipping lines absolutely refused to let maritime romances ruin their highly professional, pristine reputation. 45. Even if you were incredibly wealthy, getting a hot bath required the strategic planning of a military operation. Early luxury liners did not have private bathrooms in most cabins. Instead, passengers had to locate the official bath steward, purchase a physical bath ticket, and book a highly specific time slot days in advance. If you missed your 15-minute window on Tuesday morning, you were entirely out of luck until Thursday. You could be sitting on a massive fortune, yet still smell like damp wool and ocean mist for the entirety of the long journey. 46. Feeding seagulls from the stern of the ship was treated as a highly serious maritime offense. The crew despised the birds because they left massive, disgusting messes all over the expensive wooden promenade decks. If a wealthy passenger was caught tossing leftover caviar or bread rolls to the gulls, the deck steward would publicly scold them and threaten to confine them indoors. The luxury lines wanted to maintain the illusion of a pristine floating palace, and massive flocks of screaming, pooping birds completely ruined that incredibly expensive aesthetic. 47. First class featured highly exclusive writing rooms specifically designed for female passengers to compose letters in absolute peace. Single men were aggressively banned from even stepping foot inside these rooms. The shipping lines claimed that the presence of unaccompanied gentlemen would severely distract the ladies from their delicate correspondence and potentially lead to unwanted flirtation. It was a bizarrely strict gender segregation rule that treated writing a simple postcard to your grandmother like a highly vulnerable, intensely private social act. 48. The blasting of the ship's massive steam whistle was heavily regulated to prevent terrifying the passengers, but it created an agonizing environment during heavy fog. Maritime law required the horn to blast every 2 minutes in low visibility. First-class passengers were forbidden from complaining to the captain about the deafening noise, no matter how much it vibrated their expensive china. You essentially paid thousands of dollars to be trapped in a luxury hotel where a giant, ear-shattering alarm went off every 120 seconds for days on end. 49. Men were strongly discouraged from attempting to shave themselves during the unpredictable ocean crossing. The combination of old-fashioned grooming tools and sudden waves turned a simple morning routine into a highly stressful extreme sport. You were expected to hire the ship's professional barber, who was magically trained to predict the vessel's movement. Trying to save a few cents by shaving yourself usually resulted in a disastrous mishap that completely ruined your formal collar. Would you trust a floating barber to keep your mustache perfectly even? All right. We have navigated through 49 absolutely ridiculous regulations, and only one remains. But before we reveal number 50, it is time for the final verdict. The award for the genuinely dumbest rule easily goes to the strict ban on intensely staring at the ship's compass. The fact that professional sea captains legally enforce the idea that your aggressive eye contact could magnetize metal and sink a massive ocean liner is pure comedy. Do you agree with this verdict, or is another rule far more unhinged? Tell us below. And now, our final piece of maritime madness. 50. In the earliest days of transatlantic travel, buying a third-class ticket literally only bought you a wooden plank. Passengers were strictly required to bring their own mattresses, heavy blankets, and pillows. If you showed up to the dock empty-handed, the shipping line would happily sell you a cheap, incredibly itchy mattress stuffed with dry seaweed at an outrageously inflated price. When the voyage finally ended, you were legally required to abandon that seaweed mattress on the ship, allowing the wealthy company to instantly resell it to the next victim. The golden age of ocean travel proves that no amount of money could buy you actual freedom on the high seas. It was a bizarre mix of extreme luxury and ruthless paranoia. Could you honestly survive a week under this kind of absolute maritime dictatorship? Or would you demand to be thrown overboard by day 2? Tell us your thoughts below. Hit that subscribe button for more historical madness, and share this with your smartest friends.